together, everybody. My name is Melissa Carville-Ziemer. I am the Acting Executive Director of the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association and pleased to be able to moderate our second panel this morning. I hope you had an opportunity to stretch and get some refreshments and meet one another over the break. And I hope that you'll be able to continue connecting in the conversation after our panelists for the second panel speak this morning. The framework for the second panel will be the same as the first. Each panelist will speak, we'll have an opportunity for small group discussion, and then come back together to report out and to ask questions of our panelists. The challenge for our focus in this later half of the morning is to explore the ways in which prejudice due to racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, and transphobia is pervasive and exists within faith communities and also in the broader community. So the guiding question, which our panelists have been asked to consider, is this. What is the responsibility of faith leaders in reducing intolerance and bigotry, whether that means addressing hateful views held by members of our own faith communities or responding to bias-related incidents and troubling trends in our broader communities? And there are specific sub-questions which they've been invited to address as well. Each panelist will have 10 minutes to speak. And we are going to begin starting with Reverend Corey Sanderson, who is at the end of the table. You have a full biography of each panelist in the packet which you received today. I'll just tell you a few words. Reverend Sanderson is the minister of the Second Congregational Church, United Church of Christ in Greenfield, Massachusetts, and he's the past president and a member of the Interfaith Council of Franklin County and has worked closely with a host of social service organizations in Franklin County. We're glad you're here today and looking forward to your comments.
Yes, great. Thank you. Well, thanks so much to Critical Connections and the Karuna Peace Center. It's great to be here. I think this is such a wonderful topic and so important for us to really be wrestling with. A lot of our religious life in our country has changed dramatically in the last 50 years, and we are really still reeling and trying to unpack what has been happening. Since 1965, we've had the Immigration and Naturalization Act, where the United States has been flooded with this influx of diversity of cultures and languages and religions and foods and clothing and music and everything. And part of what we're experiencing now in these present days is the tension of trying to figure out what it means to be we the people. And we used to think that it was Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish back in the 1950s, and everybody was just default white. But we know that diversity is now a reality in our worlds in a way that it never has been before. And so the question is really, how do we take that diversity that we have and put it together in a meaningful way that creates this religiously pluralistic, diverse democracy where we can all coexist and where we can all live and be safe and valued and protected. So I think what is very important about this kind of work is that this is where our values as faithful, spiritual people, regardless of our traditions, are often held. Religion often functions as this repository for our ethics and morality and values. And so in trying to think about how we move through these difficult situations, we really have to step back and be very critical about our own things that we've been taught and ways that we've been led to understand life and people and other traditions. And a couple of things that through the years that have been really important to me that I can briefly share. Interactions with people of different traditions is extremely important. It's probably the single most important path for transformation. And the reason for this is that when we imagine ourselves in one place and someone else as an other, so to speak, there's a gap that is between us. And that gap often gets filled with ignorance or stereotypes or fear. And the media, as you probably have guessed, is happy to fill that gap for us. And so are the stories and the Facebook memes and things like that. But what we need to do as people is we need to pull together in a way that we do get to interact with each other. And not so much in a very kind of, free and open, and we're all the same and we're all equal and everything's exactly the same. But there are really tremendously wonderful differences. We often assume that difference means bad, but difference doesn't have to mean bad. There's tremendously wonderful things that we need to learn about other faith traditions. And so really starting in a way of increasing religious literacy becomes extremely important, and familiarity with traditions really becomes important. I think there was one incident that I read about where Martin Luther King Jr. was at Howard College, and he was going to hear Mordecai Johnson speak about Christian love. And this was before Dr. King's rise to fame. And the whole lecture was about how Mahatma Gandhi is the perfect incarnation of Christian love. And what this did for Dr. King was it popped him out of his Baptist bubble. Because his granddad was a Baptist, and his dad was a Baptist, and he was a Baptist, and he lived in that silo of Baptist. But all of a sudden it forced him to get out of that, to think about things, but then return to his Baptist roots in a changed and different way. And I think it's that process of kind of transformation that really is where most of the things that need to happen are going to happen. So just sort of honoring the questions that were sent out ahead of time, which I thought were so well done, because they're sort of the practical parts. So I work as a pastor in a local church. And the first question is, to whom are we accountable as people in our work? And in the liberal Protestant tradition, we have this idea of a covenant between the person, I happen to be the clergy person, the community, and God. So there's kind of this covenant of a triangle, and we get this from Judaism, and it's also in Islam. And so we're not individually held to a particular group or committee or set of bylaws, but there's this very relational piece. And it's a bit different from a contract in terms of rules and regulations and things like that. And I think part of what the basic kind of foundation, and Father Savage was talking about this, is that there's this expression of love for all people unconditionally that Jews, Christians, and Muslims believe. And that's the kind of foundation part for that. And in addition to that, I believe that there's the seeking justice that comes out of that. So in the Hebrew Bible, the great prophet Micah was asked, what is it to live this faith? But we are to, walk humbly with God and do kindness and practice mercy and to do justice. So I think we are at a place in our world where it is good to have the values and the faith and the spirituality, and now's the time to really kick it into gear and be actually doing this particular work and living it out in that way. The other question was about social activism and what are the risks that we take. And Rabbi Amy was saying earlier that she doesn't feel like a social activist in a sense, and neither do I. I certainly see myself more as an educator. But I think faith communities have a really important role in mobilizing people and inviting people into social activism in terms of educational classes and participating in marches, because this is often the entry point for people. And then as a faith community, if we are able to find different ways to then continue that work, so it doesn't just become a flash in the pan, but that it really builds this sort of enduring work and presence. And I think given everyone's different unique talents and gifts and backgrounds and experiences, that's the key to really figuring out where you best plug in. Now, I've realized through the last couple of years at least, being a white, educated, male Christian, right, that I have a certain set of privileges. And so I try to find ways that I can plug who I am and where I am in life into situations that I can create the most possible impact of positive and lasting change. And I think that's something that everyone can do in that way. And it's not a clergy thing. My job sort of allows me to do that. But as in the Christian faith, we talk about that every baptized Christian is called to be a minister in this way. The Protestant Reformation, we've just had 500 years, and the idea was that we have this priesthood of all believers, that no longer is certain people doing things for us. We all have a role in seeking justice. And so in my life, I have a very personal mission to do interfaith work and things like that, as well as my official clergy type work. The other question was, how do you reconcile theological beliefs with, actually, let me just go back one thing. So the question was about the risks that would come with social justice advocacy. And I was honestly thinking, I don't really think that there are risks to me in that sense, partially because of my privilege and where I am in life. But if you really believe in something fully, like the idea of justice, then there really shouldn't be anything that's holding you back. And there's often tension in religious communities where the community has a very institutional mindset of we need to be cared for by our religious leaders, and anything that sort of tilts that balance is seen as threatening or bad and upsets that homeostasis. So a lot of communities are very hesitant toward having clergy be very prolific out in the world and speaking on these issues of justice. So the only thing I was thinking of that could be a potential risk in losing something valuable would be losing my job in doing so. But ultimately, it would be a recognition that I was perhaps not in the right place to begin with, and that a congregation and me were not sharing the same particular values or understanding of the Christian faith. So I think there's a place of coming to the recognition where these things are more important than our personal comfort and our personal safety and those sorts of things. So then the question was about how do we reconcile secular laws and theological beliefs. And this was good. I sort of was trying to play through this. In my tradition, the liberal Protestant tradition, we've always, not always had, but for many, many years, what we call an open and affirming stance toward LGBTQ people. And they've always been invited into full membership in our communities, many of our communities, not all of them. And I think the only place that I've ever felt like my religious belief in wanting to be able to perform a same-sex union was held back by Supreme Court, 10 years ago. That was sort of the only place that I felt that there was a kind of a tension. And we can always create creative tensions by doing, blessing services and things like that. But I think in terms of the legality of our secular laws, they're intended to really protect and support people in our common good. And I often see that our religious ideals rise above those. So, for instance, I think we have a very progressive, prison out in Greenfields. And Sheriff Donlin has done a lot of work in really trying to promote rehabilitation rather than just simply punishment. And what's come out of this has been a wonderful restorative justice program where we've really, been able to sort of take values of forgiveness and reconciliation and mercy and entering someone into a community rather than just punishing them. So things like that are good. And I guess that's about it for time, but I'll be happy to answer questions afterwards.
Thank you, Reverend Sanderson. I especially appreciate your comments about the ways in which you can utilize your privilege to work toward dismantling oppression, and the invitation for all of us to consider that as well. Our next speaker is Rabbi Justin David, who is the rabbi of Congregation B'nai Israel in Northampton since 2002, and During that time, he's helped to grow the community through his commitment to social justice, inclusion, innovation in worship, Jewish education, and interfaith work. And he is the distinguished recipient of the 2018 Human Rights Hero Award. So congratulations. Okay, comments.
Thank you, Melissa. And is this on?
Yep.
And I just want to acknowledge, first of all, the work of Critical Connections, of Laka and Bernie, and all that you bring to us. And I also want to acknowledge friends and teachers that I have the great privilege to be in the presence of. And I'll just say one thing. Laka asked for a picture of me, and so I don't have a decent headshot, so I Googled images, and I sent her 4, 3 of which were me, and one was not Justin David, but Justin Bieber. And I'm sad. I'm sad she chose the wrong one. This is all about our image of ourselves. But I'd actually like to introduce myself in a way that I typically do in Northampton, which is to say my name is Justin David. I'm a cisgendered male. I use he, him pronouns. And I'd like to add a little bit more to the mix. I'm white, and I believe that I have relatives, little boys now, who are young people of color. I say I believe that because because on the one hand, my sister-in-law is South Indian, and she's quickly becoming my favorite relative, and these 2 little boys are brown. And yet I say I don't know because I don't know. I've never had that conversation with my sister-in-law, who's, her father's a physician. She grew up in Wellesley, Massachusetts. And I have no idea if she sees herself as a person of color or not. And so all of this is really an introduction to thoughts about what it means for me to be a faith leader and to engage with these issues. And what I'd like to do is tell some snippets, some vignettes from my life on the road to becoming a rabbi that I hope will be helpful in shedding light on what it means for us to be in a society that militates against our inclusiveness, even as we individually or in public roles try to be more inclusive. And I'll start with a commercial from when I was a kid. This is going back at least 40 years. And I think it was a commercial that the Anti-Defamation League put on the airwaves. And it's a grandfather and a grandson in a rowboat on a fall day, kind of sepia-covered lights, all very warm. And the little boy asks, "What's prejudice?" And the grandfather says, "Well, tell me about your friends." And he says, "There's my friend Charlie and my friend Robbie, and then there's my friend Stephen, and he's my Jewish friend." And the grandfather says, "Why do you call him your Jewish friend? Why isn't he just your friend?" And this commercial, which sometimes if I bring it up with a friend we'll laugh about it, brings up, I think, a conundrum about inclusion. On the one hand, there's this impulse for all of us to be seen as the same. But of course, in doing that, we erase difference, and that difference is precious. And this commercial, I think, subscribed or was very much a part of a predominant liberal worldview that I grew up with. And I sort of believed it, even as I had these questions about, well, is it really bad to call someone your Jewish friend when they're really proud of their being Jewish? I never really understood that as a kid. But what is interesting to me about my childhood is that I did have friends of all different backgrounds. And as I think back on it, I realized that after elementary school, I don't think either I ever invited over or was invited to a friend's house who was African American or Indian or Latino. Whereas as an elementary school student, those interactions happen quite frequently. And it's not because I ceased to become friends with people from different backgrounds. It's just, again, I think there is these mitigating forces in our society that prevent us from being as inclusive as we really want to be as human beings. Fast forward to high school, I went to a performing arts high school in New York City, the High School of Performing Arts. If you've seen Fame, that was the school I went to. And it was exactly as you would imagine it from the movie. Kids from all kinds of different backgrounds. really learning together, working together in school. And we would hang out on weekends too, again, not at each other's homes, but in Manhattan, because that was the central place. And there was nothing that we were aware of that was political about our being together. And I mention that because I went to college. I went to a small liberal arts college in Ohio that was much more white than my high school, but much more politicized. And so I saw myself again as this liberal, we're all in this together, reasonably proud Jewish person representing. And I would go to these various rallies and demonstrations and meetings, and invariably there would be an activist from a community of color. Maybe they were Latina, maybe they were African American. If they weren't of color, perhaps they were LGB. At that time when I went to college, there was no awareness of the T in the LGBT community. And they would say things that I found quite powerful, but against which I had a kind of reflexive skepticism. So people would talk about state violence against people of color. They would talk about the US government imprisoning African Americans. People would talk about the imperialist war in El Salvador. And again, not knowing the information, not having the experience, being an 18, 19-year-old with a mind of mush, I really didn't understand my place in all of these things, not to mention the things that were attributed to me as a white male, as being part of the power structure. And I'm thinking to myself, wait a second, my family, they weren't rich. They weren't rich like, these other people I knew. And, my mother was a single mother, and I'm a feminist. I'm Jewish. Doesn't that count for something? And so I wrestled with all of this. But I made a conscious choice. There was a group our small micro-Jewish community on campus was divided. There was sort of the official Jewish community that really took a lot of comfort in defining themselves over and against sort of these gestures against white oppression. To say, we're Jewish, we have a different set of historical experiences, we have oppression too, and we're not being included in the conversation, and so we're going to have our own conversation over here. And another group of Jewish students, and this only happened really my last year of college, who said something along the lines of, we are proud Jews, we love our tradition, we're going to gather, but we're not going to give up searching out, feeling out our own progressive principles, and we're going to take on these critiques of ourselves and et cetera, and really think about them. And that's the community, well, I should say that's the community I gravitated to. In my soul, that's the community I gravitated to, but the truth was I was part of both. A few years later, I attended rabbinical school. And I want to tell you a little bit about rabbinical school, because it's a very powerful experience of formation of anyone who wants to serve or even lead a community. And there were a number of reasons why I went, but it's an experience very much of doing a deep dive into Jewish tradition, Jewish life, and Jewish community. Often at the expense, because of time and energy, of being a citizen of the world. And so I spent 6 years studying Jewish texts almost exclusively. If I read a novel, it was on vacation. If it was something that wasn't about Judaism, it was a nice little extra. And that transformed me. It transformed my knowledge base, it transformed my ability to have certain kinds of conversations, it transformed the way I thought and what I felt was important. I also dove into the social community, which all revolved around Shabbat, Friday night and Saturday. Meals, synagogue, meals after synagogue, and then what you would do on Saturday night. And it was completely insular, but beautiful. And it transformed, again, who I was as a person, who I was as a social being, how I defined myself in the world. At the same time, the seminary I chose was the seminary that gave space to the great rabbi, scholar, and activist Abraham Joshua Heschel, who counted Martin Luther King as one of his close friends, who advocated for an end to the Vietnam War, against economic inequality, who celebrated with Daniel Berrigan when he was released from prison, who campaigned for George McGovern, and then he died in 1972. And so there are these twin impulses to dig deep into the sources of Jewish tradition so as to be a universalist, and also to love Jewish tradition sometimes at the expense of not being able to engage as widely as I want. We'll fast forward a little bit now to being in the rabbinate. Being a young rabbi, my first year at Congregation B'nai Israel, which was my 4th year in the rabbinate. And one of the issues that's very important to me is peace in the Middle East, peace between Israelis and Palestinians, 2 states for 2 peoples. It's extraordinarily complicated and difficult, and a topic that many congregational rabbis prefer to stay away from because it triggers people's very emotional, visceral reactions, and we don't want to deal with that, but nevertheless, it's very important to me, so how can I not speak about it? My first year at Congregation B'nai Israel, I give a sermon on the high holidays about my feelings about it, and I do so in a way that is, I would say, principled, benevolent, and compassionate, meaning I'm acknowledging that there are people who may disagree with my point of view. As I come off the bima, one of the families someone whose opinion I deeply respect, maybe a little bit too much, comes up to me and he says to me, "You're very deft." And I took that as the highest compliment of all time. At the time. Very deft. I got my point across, but I avoided this and that and the other thing. And then the years go on, I realized, no, I don't want to be deft. I want to be clear. I want to be passionate. I want to be principled. I don't want to alienate anybody, but that's part of the price of being being a congregational rabbi, which is that there's this second voice in your head of, what's this person going to think? And what's this person going to think? And how are people going to react? And the challenge is to acknowledge that voice and to engage with it differently. Time is up? All right. So to whom am I obligated? I'm obligated to the God of Jewish tradition, to dig deeply within my soul and these texts and our traditions to find the wise path. What is the second question? I forget what the second question was.
Did you say the risk of social justice?
The risk. There are risks, but I think the greatest risk is inaction. And the third, what are the strategies? I don't really have strategy other than to tap into that universal spirit of curiosity and belonging that we all have, and to try to speak to that wherever I am, and to learn from each human being. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Part of my ministry now is involving working with people in formation, and I appreciated your comments, Rabbi David, about the way in which formation changes a person, and I think that's true not only for people who enter the clergy, but also those who are formed in their religious life in their communities, and I think I really appreciated your comments about that. Our last panelist this morning on this panel is Ms. Tahira Amatul-Wadud, who is an attorney licensed to practice in Massachusetts and in the Northern District of New York. She runs a law practice with focus areas in civil rights and domestic relations law. And she was a White House invitee in December 2015, a distinguished invitation. We're so glad you're here today.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning.
Good morning.
Are we still on?
Yep.
Everybody doing okay? Well, I want to thank my brothers for their comments, and I just enjoy hearing their experiences, and I could listen to them speak all day. These are people who I value and respect so much, and I'm so glad that we're all here, and I'm honored to be sitting here at the table with them, being able to share my experiences. And I also want to thank Critical Connections and Corona Center for bringing us together and filling up this room on a Friday in December, which is quite a feat. So I have a different lens because I don't have a congregation. I don't have anything other than myself in terms of a structure to how I do what I do. I run my own law practice, as you have heard, and a lot of my social justice, interfaith, and religious literacy work was born out of necessity, primarily around 2 years ago when there was a considerable uptick in anti-religious sentiment. It wasn't just anti-Muslim sentiment, but that's what I was working to respond to because it was deeply connected to me, my family, the people that I love and know. I'll begin at the outset by telling you one of the risks, I'll go to the question about the risk of social justice activism, is that there's an emotional and vulnerability to me telling you these stories, and what I'm going to talk about and sort of focus my comments on are issues regarding racism, even within the Muslim community. And you can see how that is a personal and scary thing for somebody to talk about, especially when you have my identity. But I'm going to talk to you about it because it is very necessary, seeing how the Muslim community is targeted by so much right now, just generally in mainstream and of course American culture. And when the Muslim community also has to come to terms with some of its own issues. And so you're going to get maybe a little bit of a sneak peek into what might be quite a secret within the Muslim community. Again, I'm speaking to you from my experience and from my observations dealing with wide range of people and communities, but with an ear and an eye that I think I'm not so off track with what I'm going to share with you. So let me just tell you my lens. I am 43 years old. I am African American. My parents converted to Islam when I was 4 years old. My dad was raised Baptist and my mother was Lutheran. And I was born into a very large Christian family. My grandparents, my aunts, uncles, cousins, all Christian, and welcomed my parents' conversion. I guess I was 4, so I don't remember what that was like, but I've always felt loved and cared for. My birthday is coming up, is December 19th. It's only significant because one of the things I do on my birthday more recently is that I post a picture of myself sitting in front of the Christmas tree. Was a picture that my aunt took and which she sent to me a couple of years ago and said, don't forget where you come from. And so as I started this conversation a few years ago around anti-religious sentiment, it forced me to walk back through my life and things that I've just assumed and really now had to own and talk about and explain. Because when I tell the stories about that story, I'm telling the story of a lot of American Muslims. Okay? 20% of the enslaved people back in the African slave trade were Muslim. Okay? So let me tell you about where I think some of our strategies could be executed to address conversations around race within the Muslim community. My children attend a very small Muslim school, and they're probably the only African American family like the history that I've just described in the school. And my daughter is 16, and many of you who know me know Sophia because she comes with me to a lot of different places. And she's very aware, much more aware of things than I was growing up. My parents didn't lead conversations with race necessarily in our home, or it's funny because my parents are very aware, but that was just not that's just not the conversation we were having. But we also didn't talk about things like the birds and the bees and other conversations that might be uncomfortable for parents to have with children. But I realized that talking about race, talking about social justice, talking about marginalized communities is very much like talking about the birds and the bees. And it's that with your children, it has to start early and often, and it becomes sort of an ingrained conversation where you're constantly fleshing out your values and you're constantly educating and giving information to your children. So Sophia comes home from school a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months ago, and between the issues around immigration in the country, and particularly immigration in the Muslim community, there's lots of unrest. Okay, immigration lends itself to all sorts of issues around privilege. So if you have Muslims who are here on this type of visa, or from this country, or who've overstayed a visa, or from that country, or came in because they were a refugee or an asylum seeker, you can see how in one community there's all these levels of potential different levels of hierarchy or privilege or discomfort, right? These are not things that unify people. Sometimes they're things that people are ashamed of or embarrassed by, and could even be weaponized against them. And so this child comes home and she's realizing that this is happening in even within conversations in her class where kids are first generation or second generation American, but they're still talking about, am I really American or am I Syrian? Am I really American or am I Pakistani? And she says, Mom, because I don't often get an audience in front of lots of Muslims, she says, when you do, tell them this. And she helped me come up with a rubric for what I would tell Muslim communities when I spoke. And it's the key to how to save your children and give them a strong identity as to who they are. And she and I worked on it, and I tested it out in October. And someone who was white named it for me. And he said that is called the universality of the African American Muslim story. So let me tell you the story that I've given to her, and I gave that day, and how it matters. So I began the talk by saying that through our lives, we're constantly directed to biblical stories for inspiration. The stories of the prophets, the stories of the women who were so brave, stories of overcoming adversity and triumph, and identifying with these heroic figures as being our story, being our legacy, right? Regardless of race, if you're a part of the Abrahamic faiths, you know that the story of David is your story. The story of Abraham is your story. The story of Isaac is your story, right? And you're encouraged to own those stories as your own. So when I think about the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, who was the final prophet amongst the Abrahamic prophets, as viewed by Muslims, he had as a dear friend a companion named Bilal. And Bilal was an enslaved person. Bilal became one of the dearest friends to the Prophet. He became known for reciting the adhan, which is the call to prayer, in such a beautiful way that one day after the Prophet passed, when he could not bring himself to do it, the sun did not rise. That was how beautiful his recitation was and how beloved he is in Islamic studies. And he was tortured because of his race. He had come from royalty, but had gotten caught up in the slave trade. I think his mother was a queen or a princess. And he was very, very dark-skinned. And we were taught and shown the love that the Prophet and the other Sahaba had modeled with and by him, okay? So that's a story that we own. That is our story. But it's not just the story for the Black people. It's not just a story for African American Muslims. It is a story for all Muslims, okay? The Prophet's last sermon, he gave a very beautiful, detailed message before he passed away. And in that sermon, he touches on these points about a white has no superiority over a black has no superiority over a white, an Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, and vice versa. And of course, this was done in Arabic, so the English translation is rough, but you get the vibe of where I'm going with this. So what I did, and talked to Sophia about, is why do we allow those ancient stories and our legacy and our ownership of those stories to end there? Why haven't we brought those into our American history? So we have to. So we talked about how 20% of the enslaved people from Africa were Muslim, and how they too fought very hard to maintain their religious identity and their religious dignity and their lives. And that is a story, a beautiful American story of religious strength, courage, identity, and that is our story. It is not just the story of the African American Muslim. It is not just the story of the African American. It is the American story. So when we have children who are sitting in class and not knowing if they are Syrian or Pakistani, those children, like my children, need to be able to say, I have a legacy in this country of having Muslims here who built this country on their back. The Syrian child, the Pakistani child can tell that story with the same level of conviction as my kids can. Your children and your grandchildren can tell that same level of that story with the same level of conviction as my kids can, because you see the commonalities in those stories. And you see where you're given permission to own it, because it is our American story. And when we take issues around race and we look for models, we don't have to go a million years out. We can go just down the road. They are there. And so now when I sit with parents and I talk with them about how their children see themselves, I give your child very strong identity and give them many different examples from which to draw strength. And that will help them. So I'm out of time, but thank you very much for allowing me to share.
Thank you so much, Ms. Amatuladu, for that gift of the power of stories. Thank you. And the multiplicity of stories. It's time now to hear some of your stories and the comments that we'll share with one another. The questions are being uncovered there on the easel for the second small group discussion period, which we will engage now in the same tables that we were in before. Those who have arrived since we met are free to look around and notice where there are open seats and join one of the tables. And do you have any comments are you trying to get up here to say something?
I think you've done a great job. No need. Maybe just to read out the questions so that everybody hears them.
So the questions for our table discussion for this second round: what is our responsibility as members of faith communities and as ordinary citizens to respond to bigotry and intolerance, whether in the form of large attacks, microaggressions, or prejudiced beliefs? And what are some tangible steps we can take?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Axel Gerard. I'm the founder and executive director of Life in My Days. So our group had an excellent conversation. Really, some of the major takeaways. A lot of what was said was kind of reaffirming some things that were said on the panel, such as it is our responsibility to step up, whichever way that kind of, in whatever way we can. So one of the things that came up is leveraging our faith communities to rally around policy, whether it's on our own smaller community level or larger levels. East Hampton has been doing some awesome work with creating an East Hampton community commitment list. One of the main things that also came up is the individual responsibility that we have to each look at our own internalized oppression and start changing that. And then how do we take that change beyond just theory to also practice to all the different parts of our lives, whether it's within our family members, our work, and in our community at large. And there are passive and active ways that we can do that. Small things can make such a large difference, such as putting up a sign, or more active ways where you actually are engaging your family and your coworkers and all those different people in actual conversations. And then one of the last things that we talked about is kind of addressing privilege, and then also how do we center the most marginalized voices instead of kind of hijacking those voices, and instead of disempowering people and making movements about us, how do we actually center those voices?
So we started off by speaking about the pervasiveness of bigotry in so many facets of our life, and how one way to overcome that is by building deep and meaningful relationships both within our communities and then moving outwards. And we spoke about how that's very long and slow work, learning how to communicate and speak to each other in ways that lift each other up rather than kind of make everyone feel as if they don't belong. We talked about how it's first important to address hate and prejudice within our own communities and our country as a way to build a foundation and to move outwards, to bring other people in. And we also spoke about education and self-education as a tangible step that we can take to understand our differences. We talked about how education is so important because often a lack of understanding leads to guilt, which then leads to this sense of fear and hate of others, and how communication can overcome that, and how identities are very multifaceted, and how identities are very vulnerable, and how can we make room for religion and identities that also include gender, race, and political beliefs. And then finally, we spoke about how starting social justice conversations within a faith community can offer us a different framework that can transcend a lot of identity politics. I fight for you because you have value as a person to me, not because of who your specific identities are.
We want to thank each of the speakers. So, Tahara, when you spoke about the universality of the Muslim African American experience, I feel like right here and now we changed. Like we just got enlarged, and we just really wanted to note that and thank you.
Well, thank you for acknowledging that and giving me a place to share that, which grew from literally our kitchen table. I'm sure I wasn't the first person, but I'm saying the need for that now within our family and our immediate community grew from within our house.
We were feeling that today we're building new knowledge and new ways of growth. And Justin, your level of honesty, that's what we wanted to, like one of the things we got honest with is that feeling that can happen, ooh, I'm fearful I won't be heard, so I'm going to interrupt. And so we were talking about how our hearts have to be ready to hear. And one person said, just to embrace the next level of conversation by asking, is there more? So that grabbed some of your comments. And Corey, when you were speaking of the gap, just never heard that vocabulary before. It was such helpful vocabulary, like what goes into that gap. And so one of the things we were looking at is one person said, instead of sealing off our knowledge bases by having this kind of limited solidarity, we look like we're diverse, but we're all united against these people. Like that's the new thing that can happen in progressive cultures, that where you're not porous. So we have this image of like extending a atmosphere of we are in one inextricable mutuality, this web of life, and that if you carry it with you wherever you go, there's almost a new kind of safety and an openness to growth.
Did we answer the question? Maybe not. But some of the things that we talked about, remember our history and remember our complicities. Javier was talking about Central American immigrants that are working in our area, that are being deported by ICE. Their families are being broken apart. We are now, in this particular time in our history, it feels to many of us that our own government is doing the same kind of divisive things to our own society as we imposed upon others in the past. And so to remember our own shared histories, our own, when we didn't speak up, I'll speak to myself because I'm in my 50s. When I didn't march in the 80s, when I was a young woman, I am complicit in what Javier is dealing with now, as well as the rise of power that is currently undertaking us. Let's see. So we're also talking about how do we, has there been a docileness to religious communities as well? Yes, some have been very docile, some have been very active, but this past year seems to have been a bit of a wake-up call, and so perhaps this is a great opportunity for us to really delve deeper into that and become even more engaged in the work in the world and the struggles that we need to join together and overcome. And then finally, we also worried a bit about what happens after the revolution, and we want to make sure that as people of faith and as human beings, that if we are feeling oppressed, that should the tables change, and we hope that they will, that we do not flip the tables and then become oppressors. And Ricky brought up the example of Israel, can certainly be a modern example of that, but this is based in basically critical race theory as well. So that's it.
We spoke about our responsibility in different ways, a responsibility to raise questions, to name or ask about what is in the room that we all are sensing. to draw connections between safety for ourselves and our own group and the safety of others, which are often completely connected. To name the context, which elevates the importance of having these conversations, the context of current political realities, to think about what is at stake in having these conversations or not having these conversations. We talked about, as leaders, to figure out, we spoke about the model of the pastor-prophet continuum, that some of us engage in groups, in social activism, and some focus more dealing with individuals, and to, I guess, understand that as an ongoing evolution that can be integrated, not being a one or the other proposition. We also spoke about the importance of structuring conversations in ways that don't provoke defensiveness, and maybe this is oversynthesized on my thinking. I'll take responsibility for this, but to say there was conversation about being, a white person backed into a position of, okay, now you belong to the group of oppressor. I guess the question is, how do you structure conversations to move somebody from that place in which they may not have anything constructive to offer, to helping them understand themselves as an individual who is also impacted by what's going on, and potentially moving themselves into a position of being an ally.
Thank you all so much for giving us a window into your conversations. We have 15 or 20 minutes left in which to expand the conversation by integrating all that we've heard thus far in the day. And so I invite you, if you had questions or comments that you want to lift up to our panelists, this is a time you can do that. In addition, if you have something that you've been mulling that you think would be beneficial to give voice to for the whole, this is a time to make a comment as well. So questions or comments, both are welcome.
I guess I observe that religion to some extent in the political sphere has been what I would say weaponized. And I don't want to single out evangelicals as a block, but I think when you go back to the famous Donald Trump speech where 2 Corinthians walk into a bar, that speech, he's clearly, weaponizing them. I think the Catholic Church, Little Sisters of the Poor, which is a valid issue, but I think it was weaponized in a political context. I wonder if the panel has any thought on how we can recognize that, as you said, maybe lift it up and deal with it in a constructive fashion and avoid it. Thank you.
Great question, Bernie. That's a great question, Bernie. A lot of this, I think, again, sort of depends on religious literacy for us to not only be aware of what our own traditions say, but also have some sense of what other traditions say. It's very easy for people who are familiar with texts and traditions to say, oh my gosh, that is absolutely not what that means. Completely ripped out of context, completely distorted. But if people don't know, it's very easy to just sort of go, okay. And I think that's a definite challenge. I think it's also important to remember that even within the evangelical world, there's a very interesting and very positive movement of very younger, socially progressive evangelicals. And oftentimes they get lumped into. There's a huge difference between fundamentalists and evangelicals. Fundamentalists tend to be more of what you might associate with Fred Phelps and the Westboro Baptist Church, like an extreme kind of hatred in that way. Many evangelicals they want to keep Jesus and they want to keep the Bible as the core of who they are, but many of the younger college students would be open and affirming of LGBT people. They care about the environment. They believe in social justice and many of the other things that we would think of as more liberal mainline churches. So that's sort of actually, in my estimation, one of the most exciting things to be happening in American religion right now. And they're the ones that are standing up to say, that's not, I'm not buying that brand of evangelicalism. So you do have the old guard who is still taking scripture passages and turning them into weapons to beat people, which of course is a terrible thing to do. But there is this rising awareness within their own community, just as it is in ours, that that's not the way that texts are supposed to be used.
My only thought is organize. Obviously there are personal dimensions to this too, about how we understand ourselves over and against how people may distort our traditions, supposedly speaking on our behalf. But I do believe that organizing and standing up and showing up is a great counterpoint to the ways in which religious beliefs and associations are exploited.
Actually, I've written it, I'm in the process of completing my dissertation on the role of American Catholic sisters and looking at the question of how the nuns got on the bus and the Little Sisters of the Poor went to court. And looking at these parallels and how did the sisters become divided or become political in this sense. And what is so crucial is, I think, going back to in a sense, the gap. It got filled, okay? And nuns are particularly, have been in American culture, the image of nun is a really bizarre set of images. We're either flying, we get characterized, and it's normalized, right? You do that to any other group, and it wouldn't be. So what is so important is the image. And progressive sisters, the Vatican II sisters, became invisible because we left the habit. Okay, so, and part of that was purposeful from the tradition of the Vatican II updating, but the other piece became the vacuum of the politicization. And people started to feel, those who did not want the Vatican II updates, there was one show that was very good about a Vatican II sister working in a parish, and they boycotted it. The Catholic League made sure to boycott it, and that series eventually became, was taken off air after, and it had received many applauds, and it was really a very well critically reviewed series. So what becomes crucial in looking, and I'm a political scientist, I'm a nun as a political scientist looking at this through the lens of American politics, and what has become quite clear is to break that is to stay true to the integrity of who you are, right? You really have to go back, Christine was talking at our table about relationships. It's going to be the radical love. It's gonna be living fully, incarnationally, into the theology of who we say we are. And allowing the images, not playing into the politics of it. If we just become the other, we're political. That becomes our expression. But to taking it and I think moving into space that is really about whatever your faith tradition is, living that as authentically. It's about authenticity and being the truth of who you are. So as I keep looking at it, otherwise you get tangled up into the polarities. You get into that dualism. Good nun, bad nun. That was exactly how they did it. And they started with it with Jean Kirkpatrick when the nuns were killed in Salvador. That was how I decided to become a nun. And I was the first time I ever heard someone refer to the sisters as, these are not your typical nuns. These were political activists. They were part of the guerrillas. They were this. So those are really thoughts.
So my question is a little different, but I brought it up at the end of our circle, but I just sort of wanted to raise it, and I've been still thinking it in the context of these comments that, one is about relationship building, and how does doing this work, like how do we really dig deep beyond maybe one political action or one drive in our congregation or community, and how do we like what opens us up. And I mean, for me personally, I felt this year has just been different from any other year that I've ever done these things. And the example I was gonna give is, so my synagogue is housed in the Florence Congregational Church in Florence, and we've been there for 20 years. I've been there for 10 years. And the synagogue is kind of like ghosts in the night. We call ourselves like church mice, like don't be seen. I flip the picture of Jesus over. There's only one. There used to be upstairs, and they flip it back, for our Sunday school. But this year has really been different. And one of the projects that started for us on Rosh Hashanah was collecting money for water filters to send to Puerto Rico. And I was just and it's just been this I'm just in a whirlwind the last few months of how it's just transformed my own life. And it's gone from and so the synagogue and the church, we're doing this project together, and Alex is here from the church, and he's been really involved in coming into the church and sort of having them wake up and do things differently. But Pastor Irv Gammon, who's not here right now because he's collecting a check at the Williamsburg Middle School because they're raising money for us also, and I was going to meet him, but we decided to do different things today. We've just transformed our relationship as a minister and a rabbi working together, and I think also it's hopefully our communities as well. It's starting to go there too, to the point where we're like texting each other at 11:30 at night about this project, and I'm excited to wake up and see what's happening. And we've just done this incredible project. But I was thinking about, for me, what started is that I don't actually even have any connection to Puerto Rico. I knew nothing about Puerto Rico, and it was this wave of these hurricanes. And there was a post right before I was starting my Rosh Hashanah service from the synagogue Facebook group in the Facebook page of the synagogue in Puerto Rico about how they were sending a message to their members, stay home, services are canceled. And something about it just really touched me deeply. It was just 2 lines, and it was like, Happy Rosh Hashanah. It was so positive. Happy Rosh Hashanah, and stay home, and take care of yourselves, and there's no services. And as roofs are being ripped off, and with it, and Pastor Irv at the same time we were both just moved, and we started this project, and we've raised $47,000 at this moment. And there's Jay Brines of the Holyoke Health Center right now is on a plane. He took 100 of the filters down today. So I've just been thinking about the relationship building and how it's just shifted so much, and it's sort of like, for whatever reason, like now that's the place where I'm very oriented right now. But it feels deeper, and I'm thinking about the people that I've connected with there who I don't know, who I've only really met through Facebook or this, who've picked up the filters and are, and how I'm caring about them and worrying about them and thinking about them, and and how it is political. Like, we're doing this because the government should have taken care of this right away, and they didn't. And so how, just, it's so complex. And I guess the question that was brought up here was about, working with this family in ICE, and a father being torn away from his 3 American U.S. citizen kids and wife here. And how do we stay engaged with people for the long haul? Because now this family is affected forever, and how are we going to stay connected, and how do we do that together?
We made dangerous eye contact because I really don't have a thought except I look around the room, and I know many of us who are here tend to stay here for a long time, which means we're going to be in relationship with each other for a long time. And to the extent that some of us represent communities, these communities are historic communities. So I think that lays the ground for a kind of mutual appreciation and understanding that we're growing together in our relationships and in this work. And if you're fairly new to the community, we hope you're here for a long time so that you can continue doing this work with us.
First up, I kept getting goosebumps as everybody spoke. I literally was getting goosebumps. I'm thinking about the sisters, and I'm thinking about how I graduated from Elms College, and so I had a relationship with the sisters there, and you don't always get an opportunity to know what's behind someone's life story or someone's experience until you're here hearing that. So I just, and I think it's wonderful that you share this story about working on the project out of Puerto Rico, and I don't think I think I'm just rambling, but essentially what I want to acknowledge is that our lives are forever changed, and that we've come into this conversation, maybe some of us for the first time last year, maybe some of us for the first time 2 years ago, whatever, and we've allowed ourselves to be open and to love each other and to hear from each other and to engage with each other in a way that we probably didn't need to do before or should have done, didn't feel compelled to do. So I think that's a real thing. I think it's an okay thing, and I think we have to talk about it and continue to encourage it, because as I tell my kids or I tell my family, things are very urgent for us in our world right now, and we don't have time to sugarcoat. We don't have time for flowery. We need to get to the point. We need to build a relationship. We need to set out goals on what we're going to fix, and we need to do it decisively and now. So it's great. It's absolutely great. And yeah, I just had goosebumps the whole time my phone passed around.
I think one of the things that in our changing religious landscape in our culture is so many of us are thinking of ourselves as individuals and personal freedoms and autonomy, and I'm my own person and I don't need to respond to anybody else. And we see ourselves as these little atoms in a way, and we've lost the sense of interconnection. And so I think the importance of the relationships in communities is really important. Rabbi Justin and I were talking during the break about how it's hard to have people who are not part of a religious tradition come and be part of a community, because they can't see all the riches and all the good things that communities can do where we can partner together. I think in my own work, I work most closely with Rabbi Andrea at Temple Israel and with the Episcopal Church. Now, 20, 30 years ago, it would have just been a UCC church. But when you think about the values, and this is the major change, that we're in our culture, especially with younger folks, there's a shift from belief to values. And so this is where the rubber hits the road. This is why social justice activates this for the young generation. So when we as religious leaders are able to communicate our values about what we believe, and then even more, show them how we live it, that's what creates that long haul. And there's lots of people within religious communities that are doing this work. Bishop Doug Fisher in Western Diocese of the Episcopal Church, he and the Massachusetts Conference of the UCC, we're passing resolutions to be in a formal partnership with each other, because a number of our towns have an Episcopal Church and a United Church of Christ church that are healthy and vital, and why not partner together and work on things in a more formal way? Never would have happened, 20 years ago, but this is happening in communities already. And so for people who are outside of religious communities, it's really a great thing to be part of, because religious communities not only have power and space and money, but they've got the people to really make things work.
First off, thank you to everybody. Everything that you shared was just so insightful. I wanted to make a comment around privilege, and I'm so glad that it came up both on the panel and then in the smaller group discussion. But I think one of the areas of privilege that hasn't really been addressed is the fact that acting or not acting is a privilege, right, for a lot of individuals. And for a lot of individuals, they don't necessarily have that privilege, right? It's they could literally be killed if they do act, or be deported, or so on and so forth. And then you do have other people that they will be killed regardless, right? And so they do act. And I think another part of that, this is the final part of the comment, I promise, and I think is so important for us to address within ourselves and within our own communities, right, is the fact that even when we do act, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're still not gaining privilege off of that oppression, right? As a male, no matter how much I stand up against patriarchy, sexual assault, all different forms of patriarchal violence, I will still benefit off of every single woman being killed, being raped, and so on and so forth. And so I think it is important for us to have that conversation, because it kind of brings it to light of how serious this situation really is, and how how we need to challenge ourselves every day to not just act in the way we always have, but also how do we continuously grow and challenge ourselves in our own communities and do more and more until we don't have this problem anymore.
Okay.
I just wanted to thank you for bringing up the issue of how do we talk to our children. And I'm really thinking about my grandchildren.
Yeah.
And I'm dreading it. and it's already happening. Why is there all this Christmas stuff? What is all this about? What is this Happy Easter, you know? And why don't we do this? And it's very hard.
Yes, it is.
I mean, I'm really very troubled and trying to go through the weeds as to some kind of an answer. It's very difficult.
Yes.
Or we're in the house talking to our parents and they say, shh, shh. And I grew up like that in the house. Shh, shh, shh. Don't let the children hear. Very hard.
Yeah, you're right.
Thank you all so much for your wisdom, your commitment to being a part of this conversation, for your preparation and your gifts today. Could we take a moment to thank our panel? I think you have some closing comments. I just want to wish a blessing on every one of you, and I'm so glad to have been part of this time together today. Thank you.
Thank you. So once again, thank you to panelists and to everyone who's participated. We actually wanted to create a little bit of space for closing comments from everyone. So, you know, the first part of the morning was really looking inwards at faith communities. Second part, looking at responsibility outwards. And one have just, take a little time right now to just speak to what you're taking away from the day. And hopefully some new thoughts, what new insights emerged for you or new spurs to action emerged for you. And I'll just quickly share one for me that's just been sort of running through my mind as I listened throughout the day, that there was a lot of talk about this 99% of our DNA that we share of what's universally human, and how we come to see that and come to understand that across our differences, perhaps spurred by our differences. I was thinking of that, wonderful, untranslatable Bantu South African word of Ubuntu, that we all sort of know what it means, that I find my humanness through you, or I'm a human being because you're a human being. It gets very wordy in English, but when you hear the word, you have a sense of what that is, and that there is for all the downsides of modernity and globalism and what we're losing through it, there is this sort of gift somehow of discovering this kind of universal human. But then I was thinking about the flip side of this sort of 1% of difference. And one of my sons is working on a PhD in anthropology, and he's been with this fascinating indigenous group in Colombia called the Kogi, that are perhaps the most extant pre-Columbian civilization, 20,000 strong up in these coastal mountains. And their spiritual leaders, who are called mamas, used to spend 18 years, he says it's now watered down, but trained in different contemplative practices, deliberately different ones. And he said when there's a problem in their community, they come together, often in silence, but speaking some, and that in Kogi, they have this word that he says is best translated as the complementarity of difference. And I just find that fascinating, that, and we don't really have a word for that in English, just like we don't have a word for Ubuntu in English. That they, as a very homogeneous culture that has stayed extant up in these high coastal mountains, what they really value is difference among them, particularly when they have problems to solve, because they feel those very different vantage points contribute. So that was just brewing in me. I wanted to share it, but I know much is brewing in this room. So closing remarks from anybody.
I do have a comment about the variety of the importance of community, and I'm not sure this is working.
Yes, it is. Yep.
Well, anyway, and so you, Reverend Corey Sanderson, made a reference to the younger generation and not being so much drawn to the church for values, for your tradition, and for all of this, it's the Abrahamic faiths. But there are so many people who are feeling that evil kind of grows out of organized religion. Stay away from organized religion. That's where it comes from, this bad stuff. And if you think about, I don't support expansion of freedom for guns, gun laws and things. But the NRA is so strong because of the community building that they do, is one of the things that I've heard, that they all get together in community. To the extent that the sense identification of community can be expanded to reach beyond our Abrahamic, we do need more literacy within people's faith positions. But to have more programming that draws people who are not just coming for that, all of us can benefit, and the entire society, by creating opportunities for community.
One is I'm leaving here with a question of the balance of like looking inward to our internalized harms, looking into the circle to the correction of the contextualization that has to go on around the conflicts that we all feel stuck in, which are historical and unnamed and unaware in some way, and how much, having done that inner work and this work and looking outward, I really see that as three different layers of work, and I think we have to do them together. We have to do all of them as we can. And this is something that I just really like to say. Violence is bad, but conflict is good. Conflict is good. It's necessary. It's something to really be embraced and to really make the distinction between conflict and violence.
What I want to say is a little bit of a critique, but that's why I want to preface it with the fact that I've really enjoyed all of this and have really valued the voices of all of the panelists and have been really glad to hear from everybody. But I am sitting with the fact that I'm very conscious that nobody on any of the panels has spoken about having a queer or trans identity. And I can't speak to what anybody's identities might be privately, but that wasn't something that was spoken about. And as a queer and trans faith leader who is constantly sort of abutting this idea within the queer community that you can't be religious, and this idea within a religious community that queerness and transness is not acceptable, that it's just something that I'm very conscious of. And I just want to put that out there, that's something that is a little bit troubling to me.
Thank you. I think it's really appropriate to end with a critique. Actually.
And a thank you. And a thank you to the organizers.
And a thank you to all. And there is a room nearby for Friday prayers.
There is, and before that I just have to thank everybody who spent their entire morning and a little bit of their afternoon with us. It takes a lot of commitment to building inclusive communities that you all made so much time for us today. So thank you to all our speakers, thank you to all our facilitators, our moderators, and thank you for your remark. And I would just like to say that was something that we had tried to actually consciously organize around. We really had hoped that there would be somebody, and you were actually one of our potential speakers that we had thought about. And so, but because of, again, our own constraints, we weren't able to facilitate that, but hopefully next time we will be more accommodating. Another thing that we did also grapple with was the fact that we were being sort of Abrahamically exclusive in that there weren't other faith communities like Buddhists and Hindus and Sikhs and others who were not a part of the discussion. And we hope to continue this conversation, so any other critiques, any other feedback you have to make us better for next time, please let us know. And again, we really appreciate that. And because of all of the time commitment that you gave us, in the interest of radical hospitality, we have a really delicious Lebanese and Mediterranean lunch right next door. It's not kosher, but it's halal, but there are also vegetarian options. So please help yourself to that. And for the 2 or 3 Muslims among us, there is a room for prayer if anybody wants to go to Jummah. So again, yes, and so if you have all signed up at the registration desk right outside, we will send you a report of what was discussed today. We do also ask our facilitators and our note takers that if you wouldn't mind
sending us a few notes about what was shared within your small groups and sort of send us that information. Leaf and Rachel did compile notes, but we could really use some help with sort of compiling all of the great discussions that happened around the tables. So if you could do that, we can sort of continue the conversation and also compile a report and distribute that later on. Again, we really value all of your collaborative spirit that was demonstrated today. So.
And invite, when we send the report, we'll invite your thoughts on follow-up on how to continue the conversation.
Great. Thank you all so